Good morning. It's April 21st, 2020. I'm Zank with Bennett Data Science for today's update on the COVID-19 recovery graphs. I want to start by introducing the graphs for total deaths, for death rate, and for the raw data. And I also want to show a simulation that looks at what happens to the total number of deaths when the curve doesn't flatten as quickly as predicted. I want to start by thanking Jack Tarr for pointing out in yesterday's video that China, as I mentioned, is experiencing new deaths, but Jack appropriately pointed out that these new deaths, as attributed by Johns Hopkins, where we're getting our daily data, should not have been attributed to the last couple days. They should have rather been attributed to earlier in their battle with COVID-19. The fact that they're showing up later makes it look like they have new cases there. So for today, I'm going to avoid talking about China, as I'm not really sure about their data, and there are lots of different sources of errors in the data today. And so I want to talk a little bit about that as we look at different countries. So let's start out with total deaths. We see that the United States is still in this middle rapid growth region. We can see that there have been 42,094 deaths attributed to COVID-19 as of the data we received late last night. Italy appears to be up here in the flattening phase, doing fairly well in terms of new cases, and we're going to dive into the raw data momentarily. These curves are the optimal shape. They're the easiest way for us to think about how deaths are occurring in countries. They start very slowly, and then there's this rapid ramp-up phase where day over day we see a lot of new deaths. And then at the end, we don't see as many happening day to day. And so this day to day I keep referring to is what I call the death rate. And so I'll get into what that looks like. Again, with a sort of perfected shape, it looks like a slow start where day over day there aren't many new deaths. And then in this middle region between the two outside gray bars, this very, very high rate of new deaths per day occurs. And then at the very end, there are very few new deaths per day. We call this the slope. So this is how rapidly things are increasing. It doesn't matter which side of this bell curve we're on. If we're way at the top, it's quite bad. And if we're low, it's quite good. I wouldn't say it's good, but at least it shows, especially if we're on this side, that it's decreasing and we're going down to zero. And that's exactly what we want. And it's very reassuring to see countries like Italy and Spain getting closer to this area where day over day they're not seeing many new cases. And so the US is still seeing a lot of new daily cases. Italy is tailing off quite well. Spain is doing the same. The United Kingdom still has a very high day over day death rate. And I'll get into the raw data. We can see exactly what that looks like in just a moment. China, again, looks like they're seeing a lot of new deaths per day. That is not the case. They've actually been in this tailed off area. So I'll leave that alone for a bit because I'm not too confident about that data. Germany just left this high death rate region. That's some better news for them. It looks like they're progressing in the right direction. The Netherlands as well. Brazil still up in that higher rate region. Same with Turkey and Canada. Sweden has been growing and then dropping and then growing again. When we look at the raw data, we'll see why I think they might be here now. And again, I hope that they're headed towards this slower region. Portugal is still going quite fast. Ireland looks like they're just still gaining on the number of new deaths per day, which is not a good sign. Same with Mexico. And I'll leave the rest for you to look at. Let's get to the raw data quickly. So the raw data, if we look at the United States, the blue curve is the total deaths. It's like this curve here, where we see, the slow growth in the beginning, the fast growth in the middle, and then the very slow growth at the top. We go back to the raw data. It's very hard to sort of imagine that this blue dash line is going to tail off or flatten at the top. The orange line, which is the line I like to look at most, is showing the number of day-over-day deaths, and it's decreasing rapidly for the United States. This is really good news. Now, of course, what's bundled in here with such a big country is all of the states, and we're working on getting the state data available. I hope to have this tomorrow. Italy. Look at Italy go up to a big peak of 821, 826 new deaths per day. They started to drop, which is exactly what we want to see. We want to see this drop as quickly as possible. And then it almost flattened a bit here for quite a few days, maybe 4 or 5 days. And now I see it dropping off again rather quickly. Again, it's so hard to say that's good news because there's nothing good about this. But it is reassuring to see that this line is starting to drop down. I would hope that this would drop very, very quickly and go down to zero. We have to keep watching this day over day. Spain is showing a almost linear trend dropping here and then a little bit steeper over the past 3 or 4 days. That is, again, reassuring that Spain is going to drop down to the number of new deaths being very low day over day. You can see they were up above 800. They were at 867, maybe 874 new deaths per day at the peak. And now, day over day, they're only seeing less than half of that, 346 new deaths per day. When the new deaths per day reaches zero, then we've beaten it. All right, that's exactly what this looks like up here in this top region, is that the number of new deaths per day is zero. That means the infection has run its course. So we can look at a couple more countries and look at some more troubling behavior. Let's take a look at France, where they had this peak of, 968 new deaths per day. It dropped down to, 794, and then it went back up to 833. And then again, it's reassuring to see that behavior, that double peak, is not continuing anymore. And I want to talk in a minute about what this sort of a double peak behavior, what that does in terms of total deaths, right? How does this orange line having bumps in it, what does that mean to the underlying blue curve? And it's the cart before the horse a little bit, because the blue curve drives the orange curve. But when we see a really strong indicator like the orange curve, I want to understand what that really means. What's going on to the blue when, which is the deaths per day, the total number of deaths. What happens to the blue curve when the orange curve is exhibiting this behavior? We see this again in Germany, where they had 217 new deaths per day, then they dropped down to 181, and they're all the way back up to 256 again just a few days later. Now they're dropping, and they're below that first maximum, but they're still much higher than they want to be at roughly right around 187 new deaths per day. So what happens when, why is this double peak here? So we can talk about some of the meanings of these double peaks. These could be even sources of error. They could be that physical distancing has been reduced. It could be that there are differences in how countries measure their deaths from day to day, similar to what we saw in China. It could be that hospitals are operating in such a manner that they're counting deaths on certain days and countries are registering things on certain days. We're reporting here on the data we get from Johns Hopkins. It's always difficult to understand even how one country is measuring differently from day to day. Never mind how different countries are measuring. So I want to point that out. The Netherlands showed a peak of 153 new deaths per day, then dropped down quite a bit, almost 70 deaths per day drop, and then they went back up again, and now they're down. Let's hope that this keeps dropping to zero as quickly as possible so that they get the fastest recovery they possibly can. We're seeing Brazil drop, and I haven't seen Brazil tick up at all here, so that's really reassuring. Sweden. There's been a lot said about Sweden. I've seen videos where people are out and they're visiting cafes and they're gathering in public places. So I don't know why they're experiencing these drops and then these rises and then drops again. let's hope that this drop goes all the way down to zero very quickly, and that the way they're approaching the virus turns out to be effective for their country. I want to talk a bit about why we see this double bump, or maybe not why we see it, but what the implication is to the number of total deaths. So I built a simulation, and the colors are the same. The only thing I've added is this light blue. This light blue curve here that overlays the dark blue dash curve is, again, it's the same as the dark blue dash curve. The dark blue dash curve will never move in this simulation. But what we can do is I can separate the peaks on the death rate. And if I separate them by, say, 20%, so if 20% is about a fifth of the distance from the peak all the way down to where this orange curve has a minimum, I see that with a 20% lag, we would see 25% more deaths in this country, because what it does by delaying the drop-off, by delaying the decrease in number of new deaths per day, the total death rate, the total death count goes up by 25%. And you can see as we widen that separation, it's just more and more and more deaths. So if we go out to a 40% lag between these two peaks, which is similar to what we've seen in some of the other, in some of the live data that we just showed, we could expect almost 50% more deaths. And so if I put that into numbers, if 1,000 people are going to die in a certain situation, and then this second peak occurs, which could be lack of social distancing, it could be due to new ways of counting, we just don't know. But when we see this separation happen, it can result in, for a country that was going to see 1,000 deaths, it would be now 1,500. And if I go back to one of these countries here, let's look at something like France, where they had a bump, and then it went down, and they went back up again, and then they dropped. If I were to simulate something that might be rather similar, I can lower that second peak. And if this looks a little bit like what France went through, then we would expect to see that due to that bump, and I can't say why that bump happened, they may see as many as 1/3 more deaths due to how this curve is sort of lagging over time. So I hope this has been very helpful. Please leave in the comments any questions you have, or especially sources of error. If you like something that I can emphasize more, I'll be doing this every single day until these peaks all drop down to zero, and we've seen that flattening of the curve that we're all so hopeful happens sooner than later. Thank you so much for watching.